Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the Wallace Collection's May Seminar in the History of Collecting. My name's Suzanne Higgett. I'm one of the curators here at the Wallace Collection, and I'm delighted to welcome you both in person and online. This is our first hybrid seminar in the history of collecting. And we're delighted that the Wallace Collection has recently embarked on a partnership with Bonhams, which includes their support of the History of Collecting seminars. We're very grateful to Bonhams and extend a warm welcome to anybody who is joining us for the first time as a direct result of that collaboration. Before introducing our speaker for this evening, I need to give you some housekeeping information. The seminar is being recorded and it will be available on YouTube, on the Wallace Collection's YouTube channel soon after this event. The seminar will last about 45 minutes, and then it will be followed by a Q&A. We'll take questions from the audience in the room and also from the audience attending by Zoom. Attendees joining online via Zoom can leave their questions and comments in the Q&A box at the bottom of their screens, and their questions will be addressed at the end of the seminar during the Q&A. But please note that we're not going to be able to take questions from people who are attending via YouTube. So I'm delighted now to welcome our speaker, Professor Jonathan Conlin. Jonathan Conlin is making a return visit to our seminars in the history of collecting, as he gave a fascinating seminar about Calouste Gulbenkian in 2019, following the publication of his book, Mr. 5%, The Many Lives of Calouste Gulbenkian, the World's Richest Man. Jonathan obtained a PhD in modern history from Cambridge University in 2002 and has been senior lecturer in modern history at the University of Southampton since 2006. He's authored, co-authored and edited many publications, ranging from his 2006 book, The Nation's Mantelpiece, A History of the National Gallery, to The Pleasure Garden, From Vauxhall to Coney Island, published in 2015. Today's seminar grew out of Jonathan's research for his forthcoming book, The Met, A People's History of the Metropolitan Museum of Art, which will be published by Columbia University Press later this year. As I've already mentioned, if you're attending online via Zoom, please do send in any questions or comments that you have for Jonathan for the Q&A. And if you're here in person, you're very welcome to join us after the seminar to have a drink with us at the Mandeville Hotel. So I'm delighted now to invite you, Jonathan, to give your lecture, Knickerbocker Glory, Alphonso Trumpbour Clearwater, 1848 to 1933, and the Collecting of American Silver. Thank you.
Thank you very much. The silver collector Alphonso Trumpbour Clearwater died 90 years ago, but mention of his name in Kingston in upstate New York still has people counting their spoons. Shortly after his death in 1933, a former partner in his legal practice, Gilbert Hasbrook, noted that he had long witnessed Clearwater's overlordship and extreme acquisitiveness whenever there was a piece of old silver with which he might connect his name. Clearwater himself was self-aware enough to recognize that irresistible and ruinous impulse, which, like the road to Sheol, leads a collector to perdition by imperceptible but steady gradation. Clearwater was a generous lender of silver spoons. There are an awful lot of silver spoons in the Clearwater collection, and I'm trying to front load the spoons, but also tankards, teapots, and a lot of porringers. He lent these both to the MFA in Boston, the Albany Institute, and finally, and most importantly, the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. His bequest to the Met of 653 pieces made him the museum's preeminent American silver benefactor. I'm quoting there a former leading member of the wing, Beth Wees, who I'd like to thank for reading and commenting on the draft of this talk. For Elizabeth Stillinger, author of The Antiquaries, the only book to really consider Clearwater at any length, refers to him as, quote, a bridge or a transitional figure in the history of collecting American antiques, between an earlier period, which in the 19th century focused on associations, historical associations and symbolism, to a more 20th century focus on beauty. Known universally as Judge Clearwater, after serving 8 years as Ulster County's Supreme Court judge, Clearwater was urged repeatedly but unsuccessfully to run for office. Kingston is about 90 miles up the Hudson from New York City and about 60 miles south of Albany. And the only other geographical point to recognize really is Boston, where the MFA was, which is way off to the right of the screen. Although he didn't stand for Congress, Clearwater did fill a number of other roles. He was president of the New York State Bar Association, and he also served as the county's unofficial historian, although he would probably have preferred the word remembrancer, as he was quite fond of archaic language that had fallen into desuetude. Although they tell us little of his career beyond the collecting of silver, his papers, which are at Winterthur in Delaware, do give us some sense of his persona and his character, which I think he worked on and was quite stylized in some ways. Formal, but not always pompous, with occasional flashes of self-deprecating humor. Alongside quotes from Virgil and obscure Old Testament references, Sheol is the Old Hebrew underworld. He was also preternaturally fond of the word peradventure, which he used an awful lot in his letters. It's therefore a surprise to come across his portrait by August Franzen, which seems to, apart from the very Van Dyke-y beard, seems to be someone who's in rather a hurry to get up, put his battered hat on, and hurry out of the room. I am Dutch and Huguenot, he declared to one Met curator, firmly identifying himself as a Knickerbocker, as in one of the many who claimed descendants from the Dutch settlers of what had been New Amsterdam, what became New York. And Clearwater was very active in fraternal organizations that celebrated the contributions of Knickerbockers to American society and national life, like the St. Nicholas Society, the Holland Society, and he was also a pillar of the Huguenot Society, which I'm pronouncing as the Americans do. I know it's Huguenot here. And when it came to silver provenance, the sort of genealogy of things rather than people was also very important. Although he eventually specialized in 17th and 18th century American silver, he started out collecting silver from Europe as well as America. And as we'll see, he pushed the chronological edges of what was considered worthwhile in terms of silver. He was always, however, ready to make an exception if a piece had an interesting historical association, if it had been owned by a famous Dutch in particular or a British settler. Although it was important for pieces to be in good condition and well maintained and regularly polished, he cherished traces or even scars that could be linked to historical events, especially if it was the history of the American Revolution. Like one of his mentors, Townley Haynes Halsey referred to how a silver teapot could be a kind of crystal ball in which, through a kind of mists of time, you didn't, as it were, predict the future, but you saw into the past associated with cherished American ideals and a cherished national inheritance. Clearwater's interest in American silver had been piqued by the temporary loan exhibitions which happened during and immediately after the Civil War, often under the aegis of the Union's Sanitary Commission, which had fundraising loan exhibitions. These are from Albany's version of this. These exhibitions were almost in every medium-sized town in America during the Civil War. And here you can see wonderfully picturesque arrangement of stuffed animals. And also there was a lot of dressing up going up. This is again from Albany, the curiosity shop in which local women claiming to be of Dutch heritage would dress up in fancy dress. At the New York City's version of this, there was even a Knickerbocker kitchen at which visitors could eat crullers served by descendants of the Gansevoorts, the Stuyvesants, the Beekmans, who themselves were dressed up in 17th, 18th century dress costume that they had inherited themselves. So the Metropolitan Museum of Art, was in a sense the heir of the sanitary exhibition, sanitary fair show held in that city, in the same way that many of the centenary exhibitions, 1776 to 1876, especially in Philadelphia, many of, or if not most of the great East Coast institutions and galleries that we think of, inherited at very least trustees, if not buildings and collections, from the infrastructure set up during the Civil War or under Reconstruction. The direct inspiration for Clearwater's interest in silver, however, was probably the 1909 Hudson Fulton exhibition, which in its own wake inspired eventually what became the American Wing, which opened in 1924. And Clearwater's collecting career, therefore, as Stillinger points out, begins in the 19th century with these temporary loan exhibitions during the Civil War, extends through the very first period rooms, that's in the case of the Met, establish something of a fad, copied in Philadelphia in particular, but in many other museums that are trying to catch up with the Metropolitan, and leads on in the 1930s to a new type of open-air museum that we would associate with in Virginia, with Colonial Williamsburg, and also with Ford's Greenfield. This is probably just at the very end of Clearwater's life, as he died in 1933. In all these cases, it was felt that displays of both natural history specimens as well as works of art and historical curiosities would helpfully challenge European associations or ideas that America, the United States, was somehow lacking in civilization. It was also a way in which one city could keep up with its rivals. But prestige aside, there was also, inspired by the South Kensington Museum here in London, a strong economic justification for these new museums. It was felt, inspired by the South Kensington Museum, that these would encourage workers as well as designers to produce better designed goods and improve the taste of consumers. For the Met, this was a very important justification, and so they were delighted when Tiffany's applied to Clearwater to produce copies of his pieces. I think all these things ultimately helped the Reconstruction America and its relatively diverse population to situate itself not just in space, but in relative to Europe, but also in time, in the sense of a grand unfolding or evolution of God's providence. For Clearwater, it wasn't just economics, wasn't just about identity. It was also, he was certainly clear that the silver he collected was beautiful. To quote a letter he wrote to Henry Kent, the secretary of the Met Museum in 1913, one of his ideas in making the collection was to demonstrate to the people of America that the silversmiths of the 17th and 18th centuries not only were skillful craftsmen, but had an artistic instinct and the ability of execution rarely surpassed in any period of the world's history. It is not necessary to say to you that for beauty of line, sense of proportion, artistic balance, and adaptility to the uses to which they were devoted, the various pieces made by the early American silversmiths are remarkable examples of the silversmith's art. And yet, it's really hard, I think, certainly for him and me reading his letters, to tease apart these different justifications. He collected silver because it was beautiful, but also because it was a promising example of excellent design, and also because of its historical associations. In this quote, I think it's interesting that he seems to be alluding to the relationship between craft as secondary to art, and yet by using art in a slightly old-fashioned sense, as in the art of Shakespeare or the poet's art or the silversmith's art, he's able in a sense to escape having to make a choice between art understood as the application of specialist skills and art understood as imagination and creativity. In this letter to Kent, Clearwater presents his collecting as a scientific demonstration to the people of America. And for someone who used words very advisedly, I think it's interesting that he seems to have seen a distinction here between Americans and the people of America. So I think that in a sense here, we see a kind of a tension not just between craft and beauty, but also a question about who counts as American and who doesn't. So here it's about collecting as aimed at a sort of performance for his fellow Americans or the people of America. In the same year, however, he's also able to write to someone else in the terms that I've already quoted about his soul going to perdition, where it seems to be collecting something more personal, pathological, something, a matter between Clearwater and his own soul, as it were. So I think here there's as we'll see, a running series of tensions here between collecting as a private obsession and as a public responsibility, as well as between silver as art, silver as craft, and then the question of who is and who isn't American. So in this quote, I think Clearwater is suggesting that the people of America are not quite American in the sense that the American silversmiths were. As we shall see, for Clearwater, this started off as an opportunity, which became a problem. Clearwater was certainly very talented at leveraging his collection, or the promise of his collection, in order to secure the assistance of museums. And in July 1931, 2 years before his death, the Met Bulletin allowed him to publish a short article of his recollections, in which he shared childhood memories of his grandfather, Thomas Tunis Clearwater, a veteran of the War of 1812, an elder of the First Dutch Church of Kingston, who used to socialize with the distinguished dominies or churchmen of other leading Dutch Reformed churches. They would sit around talking Dutch, munching crullers, and sipping caudle from silver caudle cups. Indeed, Clearwater claimed that one of the tankards which he had then lent to the Met had been given to his grandfather, presented to him by fellow men, officers in the mess, as it were, during the War of 1812. Clearwater claimed descent from Thomas Jacobson Carvater, spelled with a K, who was one of the first founders or patentees of Kingston in 1652. And yet, if you look at the census records, the family, if that is true, certainly came a cropper in the subsequent century or two. Indeed, the judge's grandfather did serve in the War of 1812, but not as an officer, but as a private. And that, I think, is quite revealing in that, although it was a militia unit, if you were a notable, or certainly as well connected as he implies his grandfather was, there's no way you would have gone in as a private. So it seems unlikely that he would have been given certainly something as expensive as a silver tankard. In 1850, the census noted that Clearwater's grandfather, Thomas, who was a carpenter, his real estate was valued at $500, which is about $18,000 today. That's not a lot of money. And also Alphonso's father, also a carpenter named Isaac, was living in New York when he wed Emily Anna Trumpbour in 1847. And they had 5 children, of which the Judge Clearwater, was the eldest, born in West Point the following year. In 1849, they moved to Wilbur, which is then a not very salubrious hamlet on the edge of Kingston, where the wagons loaded with bluestone, which was then taken south on barges to be the paving stones of Manhattan, would load their cargo onto barges. Although it was a cut above the rowdies that were in nearby Roundout, which was a burgeoning, slightly more slummy popular area of Kingston, thronged by recent immigrants attracted by the recent construction of the Delaware Canal, which caused the population of Kingston to explode during this period, from about 6,000 in 1870 to around 18,000 just a decade later. So the Clearwaters were certainly of Dutch extraction, but they were not one of the grand families of Kingston at this time, certainly not up with the Du Boises and the Hasbrooks. This is one of the Hasbrooks' oldest houses in the center of Kingston. These are the grand families who would often give their houses, in the case of the Hasbrooks, to become the city museum. Just because Alphonso wasn't born with a silver spoon in his mouth, however, did not mean that he couldn't collect those from other people's mouths. And indeed, there are other great collectors from Kingston, not least Charles Lang Freer of the Freer Gallery of Asian Art in the Smithsonian in London. in Washington. And Freer came, if anything, from an even more humbler family in that he had to leave school at 14 to go and work in a cement mine. There are deposits of natural cement just on the edge of Kingston in Rosendale, and was working as a clerk when he was talent spotted by a railroad executive and moved to Detroit, where he made his fortune. And the result, when he eventually retired on grounds of ill health and focused on collecting Asian art, which in 1905 he offered to the United States and became housed in a $1 million building, which he also paid for. And yet Freer cut ties with Kingston, whereas Clearwater very rarely left Kingston for any significant length of time. So return to the census records. 10 years on, in 1870, we find the 22-year-old Clearwater is still living at home, but he's now listed as a law student. Back then, you couldn't study law, there weren't law schools at universities, so it wasn't necessarily unusual for him to study with two local judges, the Augustus Schoonmaker and Jacob Rutzen Hardenberg, both of whom were of much more distinguished old families than his was. In a sense, Hardenberg was Kingston royalty, one of the 12 founders of nearby Newport's, the great nephew of another Jacob who founded Rutgers, the bastion of Dutch Reformed education in the New World, and whose own father had been a field officer under General Washington. These are the kind of connections that Clearwater can only have dreamed about. In 1871, Clearwater was admitted to the bar, and 4 years later, he wed Anna Houteling of Gardner, New York. Again, he wasn't marrying up. Her father is listed as a laborer. Although Schoonmaker, Clearwater's protege, had been a Democrat, Clearwater became active early on in local politics as a Republican, serving as secretary of the Hayes and Wheeler Club, named after the unsuccessful Republican presidential candidate Rutherford B. Hayes. As the New York Times noted at the time, Ulster County was kind of balanced between slight Democratic advantage over Republicans, but the old Dutch and Huguenot families held the balance of power. Nonetheless, it had been carried for Lincoln, a Republican, in 1860. So by the time Clearwater was elected district attorney in November 1880, he was on the upward trajectory. He was able to move into central Kingston on Cedar Street by this point. And a few years later, he and his wife Anna moved to Albany Street, where they lived for the rest of their life. In 1884, Clearwater was proposed as a possible Republican Senate candidate, one of many such propositions he turned down. He was much more comfortable as one of the 27 vice presidents of the Holland Society of New York, where he was doing things like organizing monuments in Delfthaven and Holland for the anniversary of the departure of the Pilgrim Fathers, or giving a paper on the Dutchmen of Kingston to the Holland Society's annual bean feast at the Hotel Katerskill, which was fitted in between loud choruses by the members of the Society's herring drinking song. He was also active in the Huguenot Society and spoke at for example, their 1898 banquet at Delmonico's in New York. And this activity brought him regular notices in the press, from the New York Times right down to much more recherché periodicals like Kingston's periodical Old Ulster and Historical and Genealogical Magazine. By late 1880s, he was doing well enough to go to Paris. He went on a Holland Society trip to Rotterdam, but also took this as a chance to travel around Europe. This is his application for a visa in Paris, which gives us some sense of his nose and his other distinguishing features. This was his only trip to Europe, and I think in terms of his finances would have been something of a luxury. I think he would have had to think hard about before he did this. His apogee, his sort of zenith of his career as a lawyer came in 1898 when the New York State Governor, Frank S. Black, appointed him to a temporary vacancy on the New York State Supreme Court for the 3rd Judicial District. However, he was thrown off the bench just 9 months later at the next election, which was a real humiliation for a sitting justice who had considerable experience as a DA and on the county bench to be thrown off like that. What seems to have happened is that he was caught up in a feud then raging in Kingston between the local shipping and cement millionaire Thomas Cornell his son-in-law Samuel D. Kirkendall on one side, and on the other side, the Hasbrooks, one of the oldest families in Kingston. So it's kind of new money versus old money. Clearwater and Gilbert Hasbrook were on opposite sides of this dispute, which is probably why Gilbert said those horrible things that I quoted at the beginning about the domineering and inquisitiveness of Clearwater. So that explains why Hasbrook wasn't so keen on Clearwater and his overlordship. Clearwater's decision to take the Cornell Kirkendall side rather than the Hasbrook side cannot have endeared him to the old families that he was otherwise trying to ingratiate himself with. This is one of a number of indications that Clearwater was torn between a desire to get in with the Kingstons' traditional elite and a more independent-minded streak. Perhaps even the sense that he didn't want to join a club which wouldn't have him. Alphonso and Anna did not have any children and spent the rest of their lives living at various addresses on Albany Street. As city directories show, there were an awful lot of Clearwaters in Kingston at the time. I'm assuming he got bold simply by paying more to the equivalent of the Yellow Pages up here. But also down here is his father, who by that still a carpenter, living with his sisters, Vera and Viola, as you can see on the same address as his father on Clinton Avenue. But you can see that the family, they're all sawyers, carpenters, kindling, cigar makers, and carriage painters. So if they are one of the old families, and yes, they certainly were, they certainly had come down in the world to some extent. So he also had offices down on Wall Street in Kingston, which he kept kept chambers right up into his death in 1933. He also, in the last 20, 30 years of his life, continued to serve on a lot of commissions, including the Hudson-Fulton Celebration Commission and also the Niagara Falls Park Commission, even tangling with the great Robert Moses towards the end of his career. Clearwater's first opportunities to view and his first inspiration to collect silver probably came in the 1880s. In 1886, the 200th anniversary of Albany's charter saw the Albany Academy put on a loan show of more than 4,000 historical relics and art objects from the city's leading families, many of them Knickerbockers, Rensselaers, Scoilers, Gansevoorts, Lansings, and Cornings, and about 25,000 people visited. The Albany Historical and Art Society, or now the Albany, it's now changed its name several times, was established to give a permanent home to highlights from this loan exhibition. And shortly after that, in the 1890s, under its president, G.D. Miller, they launched a fundraising campaign to build the building we can see here on the left, which included some period rooms. Similar relics, as they were still being called, featured in an 1889 loan exhibition in New York City designed to mark the centenary of Washington's inauguration. Unlike the Albany show over here, there was a large 352-item display of silver, a focused exhibition curated by John Henry Buck, the great English-born expert on old plate, who was then working for the Gorham Manufacturing Company, one of New York's leading silver makers. Harper's Weekly noted that the exhibition was, quote, by far the finest ever brought together in the United States. At the same time, however, the review went on in rather characteristic language to point out that, quote, early American plate has bullion value, is curious, but has little artistic merit. This, in a sense, was what Clearwater and other pioneering collectors of American silver were pushing against, the idea that English and French silver was worth collecting, but that American silver was derivative and not worth investing in. While he had evidently been collecting for some time by the time of the 1909 Hudson-Fulton show, certainly for Clearwater, as he described it later, it was a revelation. It had also, as he noted, quote, done much to stimulate the collecting of the work of early American silversmiths. Sadly, the Winterthur, where the Clearwater papers at Winterthur have very little paper, very little correspondence for him before 1909. And yet it would seem that he must have already been collecting. He lent 15 pieces to the Hudson-Fulton show itself. They do, however, give us some sense of his sources of supply. He was certainly collecting from interior decorators like the Boston Miss T.V. Carey, antique dealers, but also at the other end, scouts like Eli Jacob and Joseph Epstein. These Their letters are hand-scrawled with great difficulty on very cheap paper at the Winterthur archive, and speak of a rather hand-to-mouth existence spent as scouts literally on the road, going from house to house in likely old parts of upstate New York and Massachusetts, trying to buy up promising bits of silver. In his legal capacity, Clearwater himself was able to scout out purchases, especially from, I assume, people making their wills, for example, and many of his loans to the Met Museum came with provisos and restrictions intended to protect the blushes of their original owners. He might have acquired a work from an old family from Boston, for example, partly offering reassurance that he would take it out of Boston and eventually give it to the Met. In other words, the original owner didn't want friends and family seeing their heirloom on display at the MFA, for example, in Boston, because people would say, "Oh, wasn't that your tankard or your porringer? Oh dear, you had to sell it? Oh dear." In the same way, other pieces came with provenance, where Clearwater said to the curators of the Met, "I can't tell you who used to own this, because again, I promised not to tell them." So that sense of providing a discreet way of realizing or liquidating your family heirlooms was certainly something that Clearwater did. He also went to a lot of churches. He even advertised in the Christian Intelligencer, advertising to church vestries and church wardens, trying to encourage them to sell to him, mentioning very much up front of his plans to give his collection eventually to a public museum, pieces like this, and also drawing to some extent on the fair wind given to him by concerns that sharing the same chalice at communion might cause Spanish flu, cholera, or other diseases to be spread. And this was a time when individual cups start to be introduced in American churches. So if you're starting to use this, you no longer need to have this. And Clearwater certainly acquired 27 churches, different churches' silverware as a result. These purchases could often be controversial, certainly, member parishioners objecting to the sale of what they viewed as their parish's property, quite rightly, but have been encouraged by another great scholar of silver, E. Alfred Jones, also from Britain, who Clearwater admired greatly, who would catalogue the silver of Morgan as well as Leopold de Rothschild. And Clearwater helped to get Jones an honorary degree from Rutgers. As I mentioned, the judge didn't have as much money as the Du Boises and the Hardenbergs and the Hasbrooks. And so when he's complaining, as he often does in his letters, about how rival collectors are pushing prices up against him, about how he himself is pushing up the market, spoiling the market, as he says in one letter, by pushing the price up for silver, that's not just an idle comment, I think. He really probably had to think quite hard about some of the purchases that he made. At the same time, however, of speaking of his own obsession of how he was spending money, sometimes which he could not afford, he was also able to write to the Boston-based silver collector Francis Hill Bigelow, quote, "My duties are multifarious. The collection of silver, after all, is but an infinitesimal diversion." Here again, we see, I think, a tension, Judge Clearwater torn between a desire to ingratiate himself in the select coterie of American silver collectors and an urge to hold back, refusing to let the collecting of silver to define him. The three other collectors who lent to the Met Hudson Fulton show were certainly were younger, but more established and better connected. And we know much more about them today. These are people like Richard Townley Haynes Halsey, Hollis French, and George Shepard Palmer, whose collections ended up in a number of American collections, including the Yale University Art Gallery, Cleveland, and the Met. It seems that at this point, Clearwater had yet to specialize, as I've said, collecting European as well as American silver. And it was really Halsey who encouraged him to focus, to collect fewer pieces and to focus on 17th and 18th century American silver. Halsey was a Princeton graduate who worked on the New York Stock Exchange before retiring to focus on American connoisseurship. He became a trustee of the Met in 1914, and a few years later wrote Historic Silver of the Colonies and Its Makers, which is one of the early key books on the subject. Even as he consulted such fellow curators, Clearwater could express frustration that they were making difficulties for him by paying what he called extravagant prices for even quite late American silver. Alongside Halsey, the Hudson Fulton displays at the Met had been masterminded by Henry Watson Kent, the secretary of the Met, and also the man here on the left, Robert De Forest, who along with his wife Emily helped to give the Met its first period room and who endowed what became the American Wing and opened in 1924. The idea of having an American wing had first been developed by Emily and Robert in 1916. Owing to the World War I, however, they were delayed in their plans. In 1917, however, Kent was able to inform Clearwater of their ideas, which included, as he puts in the letter, what museums call period rooms. So at this point, clearly the idea of a period room was still something quite strange and felt to be quite novel. The first scholar to deem American plate worthy of consideration alongside Europe was Buck, who did the most, alongside Jones, to really educate and encourage Clearwater in the early years. Buck's book, Old Plate, Its Makers and Marks of 1888, with various revised editions, had a chapter on American silversmiths written in quite an antiquarian style, with quotes from newspapers and directories and very, very focused on facts and figures. In 1906, Buck became curator of metalwork at the Met and helped organize exhibitions of American silver at the MFA as well as the Met in 1906 and 1911. As Kent put it later, these shows, quote, broke the ice of official aloofness surrounding what our early silversmiths could do. Clearwater's first letter to Buck dates from May 1909 and may refer to this small German beaker, which he was thinking of buying. He asked Buck if it was, quote, worth the money and of sufficient interest and value to be accepted by the museum. Peradventure, I finally carry out my hope to present such collection of silver as I make to the museum. His first long-term loans after the Hudson Fulton show were early 19th century pieces by Anthony Rash, Garrett Eoff, and Lewis N. Smith. He was clearly concerned that these were rather late for the kind of silver compared to the silver that Haynes Halsey, Hollis French, and other collectors admired. And so he writes at the same period that he's thinking of selling off his 19th century silver because he thinks he's got too much of it. He's very eager in all his dealings with the MFA, with the Albany Institute, with the Met, that his collections be recognized and that his public spiritedness be honored in public reports, especially the bulletins of the respective museums. And in this case, the MFA was something of a disappointment. The curator there, Florence Paul, did note the loans in the bulletin of the MFA, but not nearly as extensively as Kent and as Buck and as Haynes Halsey did in the Metropolitan Museum's bulletins. In a sense, Clearwater was really trying to encourage or kind of sow a feud between the MFA and the Met to encourage some competition for his own eventual bequest. He lent 11 pieces to the MFA in 1911, the same year he lent pieces to the Met, and he sent another 37 pieces in 1913. It's really clear that he's trying to get a feud going between these two, perhaps to get more out of both museums for himself. In one letter, he writes to Florence V. Paul, I am not a little amused to see that there is an interesting rivalry between the Metropolitan of New York and the Museum of Fine Arts of Boston, and between the colonial dames of the two states. So it was important that his work be recognized not just in museum publications, but in the New York Times or in the Boston Globe or in other leading newspapers. So the third apex of the collection was the institution that he was trying to have jostling for his collection was the Albany Institute, which he lent in 1917, starting in 17, 210 pieces to, adding about 200, 250 pieces, various gaps between that and his 1932. The Albany Institute made him a trustee. They then made him an honorary life member. They named a gallery after him, and they clearly thought that they had a firm bequest in the offing. In 1920, however, on a visit to the Albany Institute, the curator there overheard Clearwater make a comment which implied that he had other plans, not to leave it there for perpetuity. This caused some flurry of concern among the trustees, who had to decide how to flush out, if they could, the judge's final intentions for his collection. At the same time, they were quite concerned that if they poked him to say, you know, what are you planning to do with your silver, that this might have unintended consequences. To quote one trustee, any direct approach, however delicately made, might be interpreted as pressure by him and result in an action quite opposite from what we intend and desire. The other institution, which I don't think he ever really seriously thought of giving the silver to, was Kingston's own Senate House Museum, which is where the big Hasbrooks and the Du Boises left their heirlooms when they finally deaccessioned them. I have to say, I don't think he ever really seriously thought of Albany or indeed Kingston as a final destination. One of the interesting things about the correspondence with Buck is really intense in 1911, when Buck is at the Met and they're writing to each other, or rather Clearwater is writing to Buck almost every few days. It's a very voluminous correspondence. You get a sense of a tension between their different ideas of what's worth collecting and why. Buck felt that, or indeed said, he would not accept for loan anything that did not have a mark on it, or a maker's mark, whereas Clearwater felt that, quote, we make too much of a fetish of maker's marks, noting that he had many fine pieces which did not have such marks. Buck also felt that it was fine to collect post-1776 silver, that there was much, as it were, late silver that was still worth collecting. Indeed, one really striking letter refers to the 1911, so he himself collected a number of relatively late pieces. He went to the great Boston MFA exhibition of church plate in 1911 and wrote this following letter, in which he noted that he claimed actually that the museum, the MFA authorities themselves, said that having lots and lots of similarly shaped 17th and 18th century beakers and flagons and chalices next to each other could create an impression almost depressing and disheartening, in that when you had seen 30 or 40 pieces, you had practically seen all there was to see, except that the pieces bore the mark of different makers. And as he argued, only collectors really care about those different marks. So it suggests that on the one hand, he was thinking of collecting things right down to the 1840s, and yet there was also a sense that if he wanted to ingratiate himself with the Hollis French and the Haynes Halseys, who thought that these kind of late teapots were not worth collecting, or a beaker like that was not worth having. Buck and Clearwater also disagreed on the importance of personal association. When Buck returned 3 spoons to Clearwater because they were English rather than American, Clearwater reluctantly acquiesced, expressing regret that, quote, we are bereft of the power of transmutation. The spoons had belonged to a Revolutionary era loyalist, Edward Winslow, descendant of a Mayflower pilgrim. And as far as Clearwater was concerned, that was certainly enough to make them worth displaying. Whereas Buck thought all works by Revere were very much overrated and planned to burst the bubble, or try to, of Revere in the next edition of Old Plate. As far as Clearwater was concerned, thanks to the Midnight Ride of great fame, in which Paul Revere informed a lot of British settlers that more British people were coming, that was very much part of what made Revere, the various Reveres, there are many of them, a particular source of interest, and he himself owned a number of items attributed to Revere II and III. Indeed, he encouraged an investment banker turned scholar, Herman F. Clark, to write a biography of the picturesque, as he put it, Revere. None of these polite disagreements stopped, however, the judge from holding Buck in the highest and most affectionate regard, as he put it to Edward Robinson, the Met's director. When he heard that Buck was thinking of leaving, he accelerated his plans to leave his collection as a token of my recognition of the service rendered by Buck in preserving the record of the art of the English-American silversmiths. Within a few years, however, that plan seems to have been shelved. The judge was a very clubbable man, but was never allowed into the Walpole Society of Americana Collectors, whose members he had a lot in common with. Many of them had lent to the Hudson Fulton Show. They also claimed to come from the same old families. They belonged to many of the same other clubs, like the Union League. In the case of some excluded members, like the other great silver collector, Francis P. Garvin, he was excluded because he was an Irish Catholic. But Clearwater was good Dutch Reformed. He certainly wasn't, and he wasn't Irish. He was a Knickerbocker, but he wasn't allowed in, despite the fact that the kind of scholarship that Clearwater himself aspired to produce, and which he did produce. He produced a 2-volume history of Ulster County. Hollis French published a silver glossary in 1917, one of the many publications produced by the American Walpole Society. It's a struggle to work out why he was excluded, but it is interesting to note that Hollis French said that in order to be a member of the Walpole Society of Collectors, you had to not only be interested in collecting Americana, but you needed to have, quote, broad general culture, which stamps a gentleman and a scholar. So perhaps Clearwater didn't quite, he might have had the ancestry, but he maybe didn't have the gentleman and a scholar that was required. And the fact that Kent excluded Clearwater is all the more remarkable, as they were both born to downwardly mobile families of the old stock, whose claims to pedigree and wealth were both kind of shaky. Within the Met, this is a caricature of Kent as an archaic American, not on exhibition, from the lunch book of the Met Ladies Lunch Club. The female curators of the Met were not allowed at this point to have lunch in the dining room with their male colleagues, so they wonderfully and assertively came up with their own lunch club, where they would invite male curators in order to then, as their guests, but then would lampoon them in sketches and caricatures of them in the book. So Kent was clearly feels a bit archaic in the way that I think Clearwater was quite archaic as well. And if we look at the wonderfully titled What I Am Pleased to Call My Education, Kent's memoir, it again begins in very Clearwater-like terms, saying, I'm of old Yankee stock. There's the same claims to ancestry and the same silence about his own parents. Henry Watson Kent's parents are not mentioned, his father's mentioned once in his memoir. Quite striking to write an autobiography and not mention your parents at all. This is because his parents were certainly not in keeping with the more distant ancestors that he liked to identify with. Yankee Miss Havishams guarding parlors full of fans, slippers, and caps worn by the ladies when they danced with Lafayette. His parents were not quite of that league. By the time we got to Robinson in 1915, the Met director, there was a sense that Robinson really wanted to try and bring some order to his collecting. There was a sense that things might be getting out of hand. And he brought Halsey along to try and speak to Clearwater, to try and pin down the edges of what was worth collecting. Halsey, as I've said, helps to focus Clearwater's collecting. He publishes this great glowing account of it in the Met Bulletin in 1916, lavishly illustrated. And in a sense, tried to get him to focus much more on high-end, fewer high-end pieces rather than a more scattergun approach. It's Halsey that initially promises to catalogue Clearwater's collection, which is still on loan, remember, it's not yet been given, and eventually passes the task to a stenographer in Kent's office, who then becomes a long-serving curator, Clara Louise Avery, a graduate of Mount Holyoke College. She produces the first catalogue and clearly shared Clearwater's love of pieces with a personal association. Clearwater made this map case, which has been presented to Lafayette, made sure that every year on Lafayette Day, it would be displayed between French and English, French and American flags. As far as Avery was concerned, the historic associations were, with their romanticism, were very much part of what made this collection so important. Highgate Adams' pot was important because it had allegedly been looted, taken by an English officer back to England, descended through his family, and was then released back on the market in New York in the early 20th century. The Gourlay tumbler was important because the family, when the British came in 1777 to burn Kingston, that they threw it down the well. And then when the forces left, they lowered their enslaved black servant with a shovel to dig it out of the bottom of the well. And his shovel caused the gouges that you can see here, which he made sure were not restored. I'd like to thank the American Wing's Medal Higgins Harvey for showing me digging out this photo of it prior to it being restored in the 60s. So this curator, Clara Louise Avery's American Silver of the 1780th Century is published in 1920 and is immediately hailed as a new, less antiquary, more art historical type of history, tracing the looking at American silver from an artistic standpoint rather than simply questions of marks and provenance. For Met President De Forest and for others, as I've said, the economic justification of the Met was clearly very important. And starting in 1917, the Met puts on a series of industrial art exhibitions in which they pair works from the Met's collection with new products designed or inspired by items from the collection. And this is certainly the case in the case, if you can see in one of the cases here, several examples of Clearwater silver that had been reproduced by Tiffany. This is an example that I saw on eBay of a porringer by Zechariah Brigden, which is one of the many examples that Tiffany produced. They also produced a kind of catalog stroke promotional brochure in which they celebrated the sturdiness of the original silversmiths and also described how accurate and how faithful their reproductions were. As you can see, actually, they didn't have every ding and dent in them. They were really quite polished. This was a time when these kinds of Wallace Nutton reproductions of other early American furniture were also very popular. Clearwater was very insistent that each piece carry the fact that the original was in the Clearwater collection of the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and got very annoyed whenever other companies tried to produce work copies without acknowledging that it came from his collection, and refused permission to Gorham, Anita, and other companies to Meriden to produce their own copies. This was a time when Wallace Nutting was making an awful lot of money out of his series of very sepia-tinted scenes of models in period costume in period interiors, something which the Haynes Halsey and his third wife, Elizabeth Tower, very much lent into in their rather sentimental guide to the American wing homes of our ancestors, where guides to the various period rooms were introduced, again with celebrations of the Yankee stock that was supposedly being cherished here. This was a time in which many museums were concerned about Americanizing their visitors. For Clearwater and Halsey, Americanization was about targeting two groups. Firstly, the relatively new money, the people who were worshipping Mammon, allegedly. It was a classic Knickerbocker complaint at the time to say that their ancestors had not really spoken about money. I thought that was rude, whereas the new money of New York were not so well behaved. It was also felt to be important as a way of Americanizing immigrants to the United States. This is a point at which the Met clearly draws a distinction between the kind of immigrant culture it wants to celebrate, which is Anglo-Dutch, and the wider kind of different heritages in the melting pot of America, which the America's Making Exposition of 1921 in New York City was trying to encourage. This was a massive show which involved every school child in the New York City public school system. And as you can see here, celebrated Negro lineage as well as Norwegian, and had indeed a colored section with sculptures such as this by Meta Warwick Fuller, invoking the kind of Egyptian, as the Egyptian allegedly ancestry of their community. Now, if you look at the Met Bulletin of this period, they're not really interested in doing much to tie in with this show, in stark comparison to what they have done in 1906 for the Hudson Fulton show. In his Met 1916 bulletin, Halsey had it in the closing paragraph noted that, and this is 1916, that those people who cherished American ideals and recognized how they were being threatened by isms and political nostrums, people who were apprehensive of our future, could, as it were, take comfort from Clearwater's collection. As Wendy Kaplan has noted, between 1918 and 1924, Halsey's understanding of the American wing's purpose had shifted. Quote, a well-meaning desire to help the immigrants understand their new country was now laced with a fear that if these aliens did not conform to the values of Anglo-Saxon America, their country would be irrevocably lost. And Clearwater certainly shared this view. In 1913, he gave a paper on the undervaluation of American citizenship to the New York State Historical Association, citing the eugenicist Charles Davenport's analysis of patients in the New York State's mental asylums and psychiatric institutions. He cited scientific evidence, allegedly scientific evidence, that indicated a high incidence of what he called lunacy among recent immigrants. Clearwater went on to say that, draw a distinction between the immigrants that came before 1880, which he said were men and women of excellent character, self-selected for good traits, good genetic traits, and what he saw as the people who came after that, who were contributing to what he called racial degeneration. Now, this rhetoric was clearly partly fueled by popular eugenicist ideas of the time, and it's important to emphasize that these ideas were widely shared by many at the time. Madison Grant's book, The Passing of the Great Race, published in 1916, was a bestseller. This was part of also reflected the 1919 to 20 Red Scare, when labor activism was increasingly associated with the vague specter of communism. And this is another typical cartoon in which you can see America is, in 1924, passes the first quotas on what southern and Eastern European countries, how many migrants are going to be admitted from those countries. And here, the spectacles are labeled our new immigration restrictions, and you can see they're being given by Uncle Sam to the rest of the world, who is shoveling literally their trash into the US melting pot. So I'm doing this just to emphasize that Clearwater was not, in this case, sort of distinctive in that way. Clearwater never made a home in New York City, and his collection is much less important than those of the robber barons that were more used to associating with the Met. And yet, when he died in 1933, the staff clearly felt quite fond of him. He was so well known to the guards that if they wanted a promotion, they would write to him. And if Clearwater was arranging to meet someone at the Met, he could say to the person, just ask any of the guards and they'll point me out to you. So he was clearly quite fond. People like Louise Avery and the guards were quite fond of him. At the same time, he was constantly menacing them with the threat of sending his collection to Boston if they didn't give him the regular advice, the free catalog, and the other reports of the New York Times and the bulletin that he expected. The galleries of the new, he also forced them in later years to take on a collection of smaller silverware, including watch fobs and shoe buckles that they really didn't want to acquire. By this point, he's in his 80s, and the then director is quite willing to humor him in order to not imperil the bequest. Clearwater, to conclude, was a complex character. Rather than standing on one side or the other, the fault lines of class and of race ran straight through him. He was clearly a very troubled person. He was a joiner, but also, it seems, a bit of a loner. He was eager to write himself into the historical Knickerbocker elite of Kingston, but also kicked against it at times. He was a collector who could joke to Kent about the polyglot, polychrome population of New York City. It also decided to give the population of New York City his collection rather than what might have been more predictable for an old Knickerbocker, which would be the Kingston Museum or Albany's Institute. Unpleasant as his high-profile interventions in immigration policy are, we need to set them beside a 1921 letter that he writes to H.H. Cone of Albany. More and more, I am convinced that it is almost a duty of collectors to permit the public to share with them the pleasure of a collection. Always the number of collectors will be limited, but the number of people who can enjoy them only is limited by the number of people of judgment and taste who are afforded an opportunity to see them. In the 90 years since his bequest, many millions of people have been able to share the pleasure of Clearwater's silver, even as the debate continues over how the people of America and Americans relate to each other. Thank you very much.
Very much, Jonathan. That was a really different kind of subject to what we've had in this forum before, I think. Absolutely fascinating and really entrenched in American society at his time. So absolutely fascinating. As I mentioned before, if you're attending online via Zoom, please do send in your questions and comments to the Q&A. And if you're here in person and you'd like to make a comment or ask Jonathan a question, please do put up your hand, and my colleague Ollie will bring round a mic. So.
One, two. How detailed are Clearwater's collecting records? Do we have a record of, when each piece was bought, who it was bought from, how much it cost, and any other notes he may have made at the time or comments? Because you've got a broad picture here, but was he the sort of person who kept very, very detailed records?
I think if he did, they don't survive. The collection at Winterthur of his papers is, as I said, only about that aspect of his career and doesn't contain receipts. There's correspondence to dealers, but he doesn't, there are no notes like he might have had. I assume he did have some kind of card catalogue of his collection. And there are very few pieces where we know exactly who he got them from. Like if he got them from Bigelow, we know because there's a letter to Bigelow and other collectors like that. The other frustrating thing is quite often when he lends silver to a museum, they don't itemize it. They just say, we'd like to thank the judge because he gave us 25 pieces, or didn't give, but lent 25 pieces of silver, and you don't know which 25 they were. So yeah, that is a source of frustration.
Thank you. And we've got a question here online. Did Clearwater have, from Anthony Phillips, did Clearwater have any particular dealers he dealt with and advised him? Well, you've covered that a bit. You might like to say some more. And did he buy an occasional piece of American silver in Europe?
I don't think he bought pieces in Europe. Well, he only came to Europe once, and as I think that would have been quite an investment for him. So I don't think he would have gone spendy happy, as it were, on that excursion. He did acquire that piece, what he thinks is the Pagan Adams coffee pot, which turns out to be by someone from Jersey, as in the island of Jersey, not New Jersey, who happens to have the same initials, PA. But that, hoping to close the loop, as it were, of that particular piece, bringing it back to America. But that's quite rare. Otherwise, he doesn't buy in block. He doesn't buy collections and then whittle them down. I don't think he's got the kind of heft with dealers that allows, like Gulbenkian, for example, was such a potentially wealthy client that dealers would allow him to swap pieces and purchases in and out. If he found something better, he could give it back to them. Clearwater is nowhere near that league, so he's not able to treat dealers that way, and nor are dealers really treating him as quite a collector of that extent, like Garvin or other collectors.
Yeah, definitely.
So I'm trying to see what sort of style Clearwater collected. How did he try to define a style of just colonial American, although you referred to internal colonialism between Boston and New York, but there seems to be no consistent style. I mean, the Paul Revere pot, for example, is quite extraordinary. And he seemed to be a troubled Puritan, didn't he? What was this feeling of perdition to his soul that his collecting reflected? Yes. I'm a little confused as to an American style of silver at that period.
Yes, I think to be honest, he's trying to form a representative collection, as he says. He's pushing against the other collectors like Hollis French and Hayes Halsey, who do have a sense of what the high point is of American silver, and definitely see it as 1776 even as the point at which it starts going downhill in terms of design quality, whereas he wants to have a representative collection. So in that sense, he is thinking kind of like a museum curator already, years before he gives the collection. And I think, yeah, there's part of him who likes to tweak the nose of people like Buck, who I think would have looked at some of those Eof teapots with great horror, I think, the sort of federal style. In terms of his Puritanism, he wasn't a teetotaler. Prohibition was around at the time. He was certainly anti-prohibition. His ancestors, he happily tells stories about his ancestors drinking gin. So he's not a Puritan in that sense. And he certainly draws a distinction between, he sees the Boston Brahmins as very stuck up and as religiously as intolerant, whereas he sees, one of the things he's very proud of the Knickerbockers is that in New Amsterdam, Jews, Catholics, all different varieties of Protestant were all allowed to worship in freedom, whereas in the theocracy of the Puritans in Boston, they weren't. So this is again a tension between how can, on the one hand, he looks at his Knickerbockers and says, we're a tradition of welcoming migrants, religious diversity, all that sort of thing. And yet there's obviously a point at which he felt America's limits of hospitality had been reached. His soul, yes. I don't think he was that religiously motivated or had a complex inner life when it came to that. I think that's just him showing off that he knows obscure bits of the, tell it not in Gath, but I think he's doing that to show off his knowledge of the Old Testament.
Should we just go now to another one online from Janine Skerry? Do you have any insights into the rationale for Clearwater's restriction on any of his pieces of American silver being loaned to other institutions? It's my understanding this is prohibited by the terms of his gifts. Thank you.
Yes, it's quite a contrast to Garvin, who hoovers up large parts of Haynes Halsey's collection as well as his own, and also collects pewter and china and glass and American furniture, all from the same period, who very much gives it to Yale, but very much with the idea that it would be a resource that would be loaned out, as it was to a lot of different institutions. So yes, I think he clearly felt that New York had the advantage of being a much larger population than Albany, certainly more than Kingston, and perhaps something about that polyglot, polychrome, to use his own words, appealed to the sense that he felt that Boston was too hidebound. With the MFA is very different from the Met. In the MFA, there are certain families that have been running Boston forever, and they're all on the board, and they all have their family heirlooms on display, which they would all visit on Sundays. And the Met's much more open to new money and much more less of a sense of the Astors running the show than would be the case in Boston. So yeah, I think that's partly, as we see in lots of other Met benefactors, wanting to have it kept together as a monument to himself. Perhaps this was the monument that he felt his ancestors should have had, but owing to the decline of their fortunes in the 18th century, that they hadn't got the monuments that the Hasbrooks and the Du Boises have in Kingston. You go to Kingston, the park's named after Hasbrook. The museum was founded by Hasbrook. All these sort of great families are used to running the show.
Mm-hmm. Nigel, did you have a question? We get you the mic. And actually, it might be nice if people in the audience don't mind saying who they are, because of course we're hearing who people are online.
Right. Nigel Israel. I just wondered how much of the silver, where there are marks, which we would now tend to call sponsors' marks rather than makers' marks, how much of it we can actually pin down to an American silversmith who we know made that sort of silver. Because some of it could have been by the retailers' marks, or it could indeed, if you went to a spoon maker and asked him for a teapot, he wouldn't turn you away, but he'd import one from somebody else and put his mark on it. Mm-hmm. So I just wondered how reliable it is that in fact it is all actually American silver and made by the silversmiths that we know.
Yes, I think at this time they still had if you look at John Marshall Phillips, who was the curator who's hired by Garvin to look after his silver collection at Yale and becomes director of Yale University Art Gallery in 1948. He was planning to do had a real sort of card catalog mentality that there are individual makers and you can pin each piece down to one maker who made it all the way through. Whereas as we know now, as you mentioned, sometimes bits like masks or other bits would be bought in and you might stick your label on it and you might buy the handle or the lid from someone else. And so that idea that one person or one silversmith or even one workshop is making a piece from start to finish, we know that's not always the case. I'm just not enough of an expert to be able to tell you about the question about the marks and the collection today. The Met is good in that, apart from you can always tell a little bit about their priorities. The 19th century silver is always in black and white compared to the lovely color photos that I've been using of the older things. But they have very good photos on their website of all the 18th and 17th century stuff with great details of the marks. And you would have to consult someone much more of an expert than I to know about
I think Beth is doing a lecture in this country fairly shortly.
Yes, Beth Wees definitely would certainly know much more about that than I would.
Great. So I think we'll have another one now online from Elizabeth Pergam, who says, the Centennial Exhibition of 1876 is usually cited as the beginning of the taste for collecting American antiques, American in inverted commas. Does Clearwater reflect on whether this exhibition had influence on his collecting?
1876, that would have been quite early for him. He would have been only just qualified as a lawyer. He wasn't DA, district attorney yet, wasn't a judge. So I don't think he would have had the money or time to really be spending that much time in exhibitions. The only show that he mentions is the Fulton show of 1909 as being a real eye-opener for him. And as I said, he goes to the MFA show 2 years later and finds it monotonous and disheartening. But no, I don't. I think that would have been too early.
Anybody going to ask a question?
Hi there, John Rogers, Head of Silver at Chiswick Auctions. Just wanted to ask, in a sort of post-Clearwater age, do we know if his bequest and the fame of his collection actually changed market prices and the trading of silver, and suddenly this was the turning point for things increasing and more collectors entering the field?
Yes, that would be, he himself is complaining and saying that prices are going up against him, and he partly blames himself for that. I don't know if that leads to the prices going up, because as I say, he's not that wealthy himself, so he would be complaining even if the prices were staying level, I think. So I don't know whether this leads to a boost in the prices after his death. Something I'd have to look into.
Okay, so we've got another one online here from Medil Harvey. My reading of Clearwater's archives suggests that although he claimed his collecting was motivated by quality and style, he was far more interested in historical narrative.
Yes, well, I think that's probably fair. He does. It's very difficult to pin him down because in the same year, 1911, he writes one letter saying that to Buck, saying that historical associations are very important, and yet he then writes to Haynes Halsey, I think it is the same year. Actually, it's just a few days later, saying, "I do not collect for historical or personal association. I only collect for aesthetic reasons, for the beauty of the piece." So, I think personal associations, and certainly in terms of the way he wants it displayed, it's all very tied to commemorations. And as I said, if it's Lafayette Day, this piece should be on. He's trying to get Russell Plimpton, another post-Buck curator, to accept the loan of two Portuguese, they're not even American, they're Portuguese salt cellars that were allegedly belonged to Edgar Allan Poe. And Plimpton does what I think all curators do to try and get out of this dilemma, is say, these aren't quite up to the high standard of the rest of your collection, which is a very nice way of turning it down. So yes, I think I would, but I also think there is something about him thinking like a curator, and in a sense being more open-minded than many of the contemporary American ring collectors in collecting 1820s, 30s, 40s, the American wing officially in that phase ends in 1825, and it's only really in 1950 that you start getting staff curators on the American wing who think that the later period is worth collecting. Although the earlier generation just think it's decadent and just not very appealing at all.
Anybody else in the room with a question? We've got a couple more online, so I'll go to those. So have Arthur Drysdale. Is there any indication that Clearwater ever considered commissioning silver for his own use?
No, there isn't. He is in touch with Gorham and with other companies like that about repairing pieces, but he doesn't commission anything from them. No.
And the final one here online, I have another one coming in, from Medial Harvey. Clearwater's, it's a comment really, Clearwater silver can be loaned but not sold.
Ah, okay. That's very important, yes.
Right, and then Damien Collins, how does the Clearwater collection rank with other collections of American silver formed around the same time in terms of number and quality of the artifacts?
Well, this would be a question for Medill or Beth, but I think there's something to Halsey's complaint that there was something, perhaps because of the sort of obsessiveness of his collecting, sometimes sense of being slightly out of control, that he did acquire pieces in greater number and pieces, as I said, that lacked sponsors' marks, and that they wanted him to really tighten the focus down. So I said I think it's about 600 pieces. I think the collection that Garvin collects, formed, which is in Yale, is probably more focused. And as I said, it wasn't just silver; it was other items. But I think they would be, so far as I can tell, they'd be of matching quality. But there's an awful lot of items in the Clearwater collection that are kind of a penumbra that that would not be present at Yale in the same numbers.
Thank you very much. Any more questions? Yes. Hi.
Hi, this is Hannah. I got two questions. The first question is regarding the Clearwater collection. Is there any reason, do you know whether there is any reason why he collects silver instead of something else?
Yes, he does. At some point, people start offering him pewter, and because Garvin collects some pewter, and he's not interested in that. Why silver? I don't know. He certainly doesn't. The only other thing he collects, weirdly, are views of Niagara Falls, because he's a commissioner of Niagara Falls State Park, which is intended to sort of protect that heritage. But otherwise, I think it must have been some element. I mean, even I'm not a silver expert. Even I, having worked on this as part of a broader history of the Metropolitan Museum, and wanted to explore ideas of American identity. Even I find being drawn into, I now look at these spoons and I think, wow, there's that sense of the haptic quality of the sense of the connection, touching something that they touched. That's part of customs and ritual associated with these communities, and the frequency with which they're marked as they're passed, and often have one family will pass it down. They might put the initials of each generation on it as they go down. I think that was probably something that appealed to his interest in, as I said, genealogy and provenance and that sort of thing.
Thank you. The second question is regarding Tiffany's reproduction of his collection. Is there any specific reason for Tiffany's to reproduce part of the Clearwater's collection? Is it because of the support of American culture, or is it because of the aesthetic value or historical value of those pieces?
I think it's partly because Tiffany already has a relationship at this point with the Met. As early as the 1880s, they're producing jewelry modeled on the Cesnola collection of Cypriot antiquities, founded by the first director. I think what's interesting now, in view of what happens later in the Met when it really gets going with its shops and it's where you can buy reproductions, is that there's no profit to either Clearwater or the museum from this. The profit's all to Tiffany. I'm sure later directors would have probably wanted a cut from that. My sense, and here, if anyone listening knows about this aspect of Tiffany, I have to say literature doesn't say much about it because it's reproductions. It's not as interesting as more original pieces. But if there's someone who knows about this aspect of Tiffany, that would be interesting. I think the pieces they choose, I think it's interesting that they choose, among other pieces that they reproduce, a chalice. So they are thinking maybe about church market as well as. So Clearwater's trying to get churches to give up their chalices, and then Tiffany starts copying them so that churches can buy them again. But I think Porringers, there was a clear sense of continuation of them as a gift on baptism and to children on the occasion of their birth and things like that. So I mean, looking on eBay, I found examples of that Zachariah Brigden reproduction with what looks to me like 1950s style engraving been added to them. So they clearly were, although the original marks of the original owners were left off by Tiffany, apart from Clearwater's, other people could, as it were, inscribe them with their own family initials. So I think it's part of this broader discovery of colonial America, the association with the founding fathers, all that sort of thing, which in the 1930s really takes off with these more immersive Deerfield and other colonial Williamsburg kind of thing.
Yeah, thank you. Sorry, can I ask the last question? And because you just mentioned that, well, actually, Clearwater collection or Met doesn't have any profit or make any money out of the reproduction by Tiffany. So I was thinking, well, Tiffany, by reproducing the Clearwater collection, it would have been paying some kind of royalties. So it seems that there isn't any, according to your knowledge.
No, there's no royalty. No, I mean, the royalty in the sense is in kind, in the sense that this is a point where Richard Bach, the first industrial associate at the Met, whose job it is to prove that the Met pays its way in terms of inspiring and promoting better designed products for American consumers. And they are desperate to find hard evidence of this happening. And this is one of the relatively rare examples where they can make a clear connection between that object in a case and this is it being used by an American company to make money that might otherwise go to imports or imported goods from somewhere else. So I think that's why, one reason why they're so pleased that they're not really asking for a royalty.
Thank you.
We need to stop in a couple of minutes. We've got one more question has come in online. Victoria A. writing, if pewter is collectible, I'm just wondering without any knowledge at all, but if pewter is collectible, but there is much American silver that, although plated, has wonderful form, especially in the 1800s and earlier, how many pieces of plated silver might he or others have collected?
I don't think there's much. Medill and Beth would know much more. I don't think there's much plated stones there at all. I mean, his big endpoint is when, as he says, the introduction of machinery. So there is. I think there might be oddly enough a Mexican chalice which he thought was Spanish, which might be, but otherwise I don't think there's much.
Thank you very much. And I've just got a quick question. Maybe you'd like to tell us something about the form your book will take and how Clearwater will fit into that. Do you have a dedicated chapter on silver and about materials?
Yeah, I mean, this will hopefully explain to the specialists why I'm here at all, really. I'm writing history of the Metropolitan Museum of Art, which is coming out next year. And the idea was to call it the people's history to try and make it less a kind of directorial reign by reign or bequest by bequest history and more organized thematically around groups of people. So for the Americans, as in Americans and how the Met helps to construct what it means to be American around the foundation of the American wing in 1924. I was very fortunate to stumble across the Clearwater papers. And when I found his views on immigration, that really was a real gift because I already wanted to try and make that connection, which is even stronger, I think, at MFA and other museums, between this point where there's so much concern about socialism and communism and these migrant communities, at the same time as these Walpole societies are really getting going, institutionalizing their very particular vision of what it means to be an American. So Clearwater's there for a chapter that isn't really about silver per se, but what his collecting of silver says about the Met's role making Americans, really. So there are other chapters looking at women curators, for example, another chapter looking at things like the 1969 Harlem on My Mind exhibition, looking at how the Met represented or didn't the people of color living up in Harlem, and other sort of communities like the Guards, a chapter on the Guards, for example. So trying to write back into the institutional history, groups of people, women curators, the sort of B-list collectors like Clearwater, who's not a Morgan, he's not a Havemeyer, he's not an Altman, who otherwise don't get included in these histories. And yet I'm sure if you're a curator at the Met, you will hopefully recognize these kind of behaviors from many of your benefactors, would-be benefactors. I mean, at the upper level, when you look at Eli and Edya Broad, how they've behaved to the Los Angeles County Museum, there's a similar sort of sense to the way, I suppose, in the Albany Museum, where they name a room after him, and then the bequest doesn't come. Same way, but like with Morgan, they name a wing after Morgan, and he doesn't leave the collection to them. So yeah, it's interesting how these patterns never really go away.
It sounds like it's going to be really, really fascinating way of looking at the history of the collection. Thank you very much. So as I mentioned a while ago, if you're here in the room and you'd like to come for a drink with Jonathan, what I suggest is that you just stay here and we could go over together to the Mandeville Hotel, which is just a minute or so away. Do you want to put up? You've done it. It's very impressive. Yeah, so if you'd like to join the Wallace Collections History of Collecting mailing list and receive our seminar programme for 2023, then please do write to collection@wallacecollection.org, the email address that you can see at the bottom there. We've also got some hard copy programmes for the year down here. So if you don't have one and you'd like to have one, then please do just come and ask. So the seminars in the history of collecting are going to continue to be hybrid, and our next seminar will take place both here and online at 5:30 on Monday, the 26th of June. And you have the speaker and her title up on the slide. Alicia Atanasio, a PhD candidate at the University of Birmingham, is going to give her paper, The Fortunes of Baroque Neapolitan Art in English Collections During the Grand Tour, 1680 to 1800. So it just remains for me to thank you, Jonathan, again for a really fascinating and insightful lecture. I'm sure you'd all like to join me in thanking him again. That was really fantastic. That was great. On behalf of the Wallace Collection and Bonhams, thank you all very much for attending, both online and in person. And we look forward very much to seeing you at future seminars, on future visits to the Wallace Collection and other online events. Thank you very much. Yes, that was... It's great. It's really interesting.